Hello and welcome back to Parley. This prompt was written by vampbug. Hope you'll enjoy listening. It's about how good drawing cards is in Commander, and we're going to talk a little bit through a mono black Flash Voltron Commander deck that you made, a game you played with it, and some concerns you've been having in your Commander playgroup. And I'm going to diagnose a little bit, a bit of a deck doctor Parley for you. Vampbug begins, Drat, drawing cards in Commander is really good. I've been playing Commander a lot this year. Well, I actually only started playing the format at all this year, but all my friends have been down to play rather frequently. Let me recount to you my first ever win in Commander, the deck I did it with, and some of the issues I'm running up against in this brave new format. Here is the deck list. This deck uses all of the unique traits of this dorky dragon. I think this is a cool card to put opponents on a fast clock. Dragon costs 4 mana, is a flying 5/2, has flash, and doesn't pay his taxes by ideally never touching the command zone a second time after turn 3. I made this deck out of a desire to play a strategy that is resistant to board wipes and plays at instant speed. This one assembles a big threat at instant speed before my turn begins by equipping a creature that can replay itself if it dies. It ended up being a rather involved deck in terms of construction. The deck is mono black, but it doesn't reanimate anything, nor does it sacrifice little tokens for value, some typical black things. Some of the card choices might seem weird, but that's how I felt this dragon should be played. Ramp and early turns. You might notice, I did, that this deck has 14 cards, which costs 2 mana that ramp, and I'm covering some of them, but audience, you don't need to see the rest of them because there are other cards that cost 2 mana and ramp. Accelerate your mana. I plug some numbers in a calculator, and that's a 76% chance to have one on turn 2 before mulligans are factored in. This is great because it leads to the commander being flashed in on turn 3 before my turn 4 starts, and attacking for at least 5 commander damage immediately thereupon. Turn 3 is theoretically pretty big for a lot of other decks. They're ramping, or they're playing a commander like me, but they're not developing flying blockers or leaving up removal mana. That's turns 2 and 3 accounted for in the deck. I put in some weirder cards like Troll of Khazad-dûm in there. Because they cycle for 1 mana and theoretically streamline my turn 1 as well by fixing draws. Right, you could swamp cycle it on turn 1, and there's a few other cycling cards in here that are 1 mana or really cheap cycling costs. Street Wraith Classic is 2 life. The idea being that you can make it even more likely that you get those, and then if you do need a body later in the game, they're there. It makes sense as a deck building choice. Now, the rest of the parlay is going to go on to talk a little bit about some of the kind of playgroup situation, but I want to briefly pause and talk about the deck a little, because I think that it's going to come up later in this discussion as well. So this is pretty interesting. Looking at this deck as a whole, you can see some of vampbug's particularities as a deck builder, and some things that it seems like maybe you or your playgroup are going for. You can see some things that seem like they appeal to you, like things that you just value, you like as a player. You can see some disciplines, and you can also see some not shortcomings as much as just like there are consequences to building decks this way. So I want to talk about those a little because I think it's very interesting. I wouldn't pretend to be an expert at this subject. It's just something I've kind of interrogated a lot myself, and so I've noticed in my own deck building how it's changed. So I'm going to try to use that here, and I think I have some maybe interesting things to say. First of all, I really admire this deck list personally. I think there is some good discipline in here that a lot of players would have more fun if they did, but they live their whole life and they never get to that point. Like already, I feel like if for some reason it was my job to professionally coach you to make fun commander decks, and what a job that would be, it doesn't sound like the worst thing ever, I would be very lucky to have you as a client. I would just like to say that. You play 39 lands. I might actually consider playing more in some cases, but that is like a good amount. When you play constructed Magic the Gathering, okay, put this away for a sec. Listen to me. People, some of you play Commander in the audience. Listen up. Put down your, what are you listening to this on? Your phone on average? Checks analytics. Yeah, like 40% of you are on your phone. Just listen to me for a sec, okay? When you play Constructed Magic the Gathering, you've got a 60 card deck. You're playing, standard or whatever, and you have a 60 card deck. And what is the kind of basic number of lands that you tend to play as a starting point? 24. That's right. Generally, 24 or around there, 22, maybe 20 for a super aggressive aggro deck, maybe 26, 27, 28 for a control deck, but around 24, which is 40%. Now, let me ask you something. In Commander, when you have an 100 card deck, how many cards is 40% of 100? It's 40. It's 40 lands. It would be normal, you know what I mean? Like, and the game is gonna go to like 7. Okay, I'll stop. You did that, and I think that's great. Now, it can often be a little less in Commander because of a few things. First of all, you probably have some and really more draw than like a, even a control deck would. And so you will draw more land, although you will also draw more non-land. And that means that if anything, it might be worth putting in more land. It's really valuable to hit land drops into turns 6, 7, 8 at a lot of power levels that people play Commander at. And there are certainly cards in this deck that aren't that, like, this deck isn't going to win before turns 6, 7, or 8. So I think it's fair to say it would be good to get land drops. I don't think that vampbug, you specifically, necessarily want or need to add like more lands to this deck. This is just me getting off of my high horse rant about, you definitely will have a better deck if you put in like at least 40, if not more lands. I usually go 39 as the minimum for any Commander deck I make, and it's hard to imagine a deck that's not doing something really weird, that doesn't want like high 30s or is like a CEDH deck, competitive, if you want to say it that way, level deck. Thing number 2, one very common way people do this is by going really hard on the modal double-faced cards, and you've done that, and I think that's great. There's really not a reason not to. These are not as good as the land all of the time, though the new ones are pretty darn close. If you need this to be a land, you can pay 3 life, and it's essentially a swamp. We will get back to that later, but it's mostly a swamp. And paying 3 life, like on one of your 40 land drops, so that you have, land when you need it, and it's a removal spell, albeit a little bit of an overcosted one when you don't need the land, is really good. Certainly the new modal double face cards are really, really good. The ones where you can pay 3 life to have it enter untapped. It's like almost exactly the same as a land in Commander. There's almost 0 drawback to playing these. There really isn't any reason not to play, like, at least the good ones, and really a lot of them are very broad. Looking at these, right, it's a 3/1 for 3 that knocks out someone's entire graveyard. It's a 4 mana instant speed destroy creature or planeswalker. Not incredible, but these are effects that will be useful every single game for sure, and they cost literally nothing to put in your deck. You can just replace a land with them. I would replace a non-land with them personally, but whatever. Really, really good. Double thumbs up. So that's really great. And you also have a ton, absolutely silly, with draw and ramp, which makes my heart sing. However, the romance has ended here, vampbug. This is a lot of mana rocks that don't go big. Like, something that I really noticed as a big hole in this deck is it doesn't have any of black's like a big mana thing that you see in black sometimes. There are these effects that will make a swamp tap for 2 mana instead of 1. That was what I was getting back to with the idea that these have like no cost. They have a minor drawback, especially in a mono black deck, which is that if it was literally a swamp, which like the better part of 50% of the time you'll probably want it to just be a swamp, but if it was a swamp, then those mana doublers would double it. But I don't think, if you put it a different way, that just the existence of cards that can make swamps tap for 2 means you should never play things that are not swamps. Like, there's some really, really good non-basic lands in here. Really good. And that's absolutely still worth doing, at least in my opinion. So I'm not saying there should be no things that are not swamps. I do think those cards that double how much mana swamps tap for are very good in this deck. You played a lot of the good non-basics that would have come to mind, Bojuka Bog, the modal double-faced ones, the lands that cycle. Personally, I like these, though I'm not sure if they're really worth it in this deck. We'll kind of come back to getting through your deck to the things that are good later. I'm not sure this is ultimately that great in this deck, but I like those cards. I get why it's in there. War Room, it makes sense. But you still have 26 swamps, even after including those. So I think those cards are still amazing. You know, 1 out of every 4 pieces of cardboard in your deck taps for 2 mana instead of 1. That's insane. That's really good. It turns a lot of your swamps into these mana rocks for only a couple of deck slots, because there aren't that many of those cards that make swamps tap for like 2 mana. Whenever you tap a swamp, you get 1 black or whatever. Nirkana Revenant. Nirkana Revenant is one of those if you need a starting point, but there's like a handful of them. Anyway, so that's one thing, like the mana doesn't go super big. And that's the other thing I noticed, is that this deck is very focused and very disciplined, but it's also not very ambitious. Like the thing it does is almost something I would expect someone to do to win a one-on-one game of Magic, not something that I'm that confident will kill 3 opponents. Just because it is not huge. You know, if you look at it another way, to be overly critical for the sake of discussion, you've limited yourself to all black just to play a 5/2 with flash and flying, you know, and you can't do anything but play it at instant speed. You know, you still have to wait till your next turn, untap, equip it at sorcery speed with some piece of equipment with it. You've got some good piece of equipment in here, and then attack with it to do, you know, some damage. Additionally, you need to pay the equip cost, though you have picked a lot of like on the cheaper side equip costs. There are still some expensive ones that I think are good in this deck, like Batterskull. And a lot of your removal is not very cheap. You picked a lot of what I would describe as like value removal. Cards that kill a creature and then some extra, so Asterian's Thirst. It's 4 mana, it's instant speed. It says exile target creature, put X 1/1 counters on a commander you control, where X is the power of the creature exiled this way. I'm just reading it for the benefit of the audience. This is a sensible card in this deck in some ways. You know, it kind of Voltrons your commander. It's instant speed. It's even the same cost as your commander. So you can follow up playing your commander with this to kind of grow it at instant speed. There's not that many effects in this deck that make your commander stronger at instant speed specifically, but I don't mean to nitpick. You could add more. But I don't know if I like this one, because if you wanted to get a creature out of the way, like a blocker out of the way, this is just a lot of mana for doing that, when I was really surprised not to see like Tragic Slip and Fatal Push in a deck like this. Now, Fatal Push especially is a little questionable. It's 1 mana to destroy a creature with converted mana cost 2 or less, and if a permanent has left the battlefield that turn, you can target something with mana cost 4 or less instead. Fatal Push, not Tragic Slip. Tragic Slip is, I think, just straight up incredibly good in this deck. I would definitely windmill slam Tragic Slip into this deck. Fatal Push might seem a little weird, but its main drawback is that it's kind of like a go small card. You know, it seems like, oh, well, it only kills like small to medium stuff. But I feel like that's often what this deck wants to do in the mid game. You know, you sort of like nuke a utility creature that happens to have flying that could get in Eben Death's way, for example. There's not much trample in here. Also, that was something I noticed. It's pretty common in my experience in Commander for there to be like little flyers, flying tokens, but a lot of this equipment, they're good pieces of equipment. I like a lot of the choices you made. Lash Writhe makes total sense to me. Batterskull, I think this is a deck where this card makes sense. I like the idea of Strength Testing Hammer. This is card draw, but it also makes the creature, you know, on average, you know, 3.5 power stronger. Good, you know, this is a good card. I hadn't seen this before. Transmorgard's Crown, I think this is, it doesn't really have synergy with this deck's strategy, but it's still just a good card. It's decent beats, and then, you know, you get a card draw recompense if the equipped creature dies. And it doesn't have very good synergy with this deck because you don't have very many creatures just on the whole, but I think it's still a good enough card that it's like, that's still worth running. I like that you packed it into the draw, that kind of roll condensing thing. You're doing that pretty well as well. I had forgotten to say that. Anyway, you know, there's good equipment in here, but not that gives trample, which I feel like you would be really good in this deck. And I also think that vigilance might be surprisingly workhorsey. You've got a good workhorsey. That's fun. It sounds ridiculous, but you know what I mean. You have a good amount of ways to protect your commander. I was happy with this section, though it's a little small in my opinion compared to how massive the draw section is. We'll talk about that later. But, big but, I don't feel like there are actually that many benefits to protecting this commander. You just miss one swing at an opponent's face. Whereas if your commander had vigilance, then protecting your commander is also you get a defender the whole time. And it's a 5-2. You know, you might be thinking, well, blocking, what are you doing? Zandy is just going to die. But a lot of these equipments make it very, very chonky. Absolutely beef. Now, not all of them will it be good. You know, strength testing hammer only triggers when it attacks. It does literally nothing unless the creature's attacking. Transmorgant's Crown only gives power, and yeah, when it dies, you draw a card, but you ideally don't want it to die. So sure, not all of them are amazing with it, but a lot of and there aren't that many pieces of equipment in this deck on the whole, just as an aside, but there are that many Voltron things to power up Even Death on the side, but we'll get back to that. But just to say that if it had Vigilance, you could be using that as you've protected your defender for the other rounds as well. And you could have the creature really brawl. I feel like Batterskull is crazy in this deck. If you can keep Even Death alive, and you've got a machine gun of removal, and you can attack with lifelink, and then block like 1 or 2 attacks with lifelink, this deck is unstoppable if you keep that going, you know? And I think Vigilance is a good amount of that work. And therefore it would be valuable to seek some out elsewhere. The card that comes to mind, just to pull it up for a sec, is, what's it called? Sword of Vengeance? Yep. So this is an equipment that gives the equipped creature, over here, gives the equipped creature 2 power, and then first strike, vigilance, trample, and haste. I reckon almost all keywords you really want, barring maybe haste, but it could still come up sometimes. First strike is maybe a bit of a yawn, but still good. The creature has very high power and low toughness, so it's still not bad. Vigilance, I was talking about. Trample, random flying blockers, no problem. Trample right over them, and then haste. I feel like this is the type of equipment that fits this commander better, or at least just also run this, as well as other stuff. Seems good to me. So your mileage may vary, but if you wanted recommendations to power up the deck without making it something else, those are some things I would do. I would add more equipment, and I would look for trample and vigilance as keywords. There are a few other things that come to mind too, like lifelink is not bad either. Loxodon Warhammer might be okay in here. Fortunately, there's a good amount of them that have green-like keywords, but are just artifacts. So that's one thing. Bigger mana, a few sources of bigger mana cards, I think is the second one. That would be strong in this deck. It's mono black, so you get to take advantage of them. I think there are enough 2-mana rocks that I'm not entirely convinced that it's good for the deck. Like, I feel like once you get to turn, and we'll get to this in a second when we read through what you said happened, when the deck gets past turn like 4 or 5, the benefit of constructing the deck in this streamlined way has kind of gone away, and I worry that you pay too much in terms of deck construction space to have that like turn 2 rock, turn 3 commander. You pay a lot in terms of deck space to get that benefit. I'm just not sure that that's enough if you're looking to power the deck up. And then we'll talk a little bit later about a few things related to like big pile of draw and big pile of ramp. I kind of said it a little bit earlier. Basically where I'm going to go with that is like role compression, picking the cards that are multiple of those categories, so you can run more other stuff without running less of those things that I think it's valuable to be running like about that much. But let's do a little interim really quick about like the goals of these deck modifications, because something I could start doing is recommending other commanders, or saying limiting your deck to mono black to play a 5/2 with flash just isn't good. But like, who cares? I don't know. I mean, I love Even Death Draco Lich. I think it's a cool card. There's this doesn't really have to do with this deck, but there's this little package of like zombie dragon black creatures. It reminds me a little bit of Red's little cycle of phoenixes, creatures that will come back from the graveyard, often when you play an instant or sorcery, to play into Red's Spellslinger thing. There's a little arc of like black zombie dragon related cards, or zombies. Bladewing's Thrall is another example. Bladewing, and there's a few others, Even Death included, where you can do a thing in a deck that probably not with them as your commander, but where you mill and then you have a bunch of like black zombie dragons recurring out of the graveyard. Black gets these creatures that are like 1 or 2 mana, and it's like a zombie that keeps coming back to life. And I like how they have like a bigger version, like 4 to 6 mana dragons come back to life. I've always really liked that cycle of cards, and I don't at all begrudge you wanting to play this as a commander, regardless of its like raw power. That can be a lot of the fun. I just wanted to say, yeah, obviously you could go in the direction of, well, it's just not that powerful of a concept necessarily, but who cares? Like, I'm fine saying that. And if that's how you felt, if you were looking for a more powerful commander, you could have asked that. I reckon you don't want that. You want to try making this stronger and use it as a way to talk about like power level and playgroup dynamic and card draw. So we'll start talking about that now. But just as an aside to an aside. Yeah, I mean, I think the what's going to happen in a minute is as we break down the second half of the parlay, I'm going to say a lot of things that are my perspective on like having fun playing Commander, but there are a lot of ways to have fun playing Commander. And I don't want you to feel like it's like wrong to do it this way. Another problem is that, as you said, it sounds like you and maybe your friend group are somewhat new to the format, or like your interaction with them is somewhat recent. And so it's fine to just kind of let things evolve as they go. I think my concern with a lot of people having fun with Commander is often just that it doesn't seem to me like you can easily get from point A, a sort of starting point, to point B. There's kind of a happy medium where everything has come to equilibrium, but it's not necessarily anywhere near as fun as it could be, or not everyone even is having fun, but people just really want their group activity. And then C, some further ground state that you could get to with enough deliberate manipulation of people's perspectives, where the game is much more fun for everyone, but you have to do some weird stuff to get there. I'll try to explain what I mean. Let's read the second half. Meat of the parlay. So okay, this is like an aggro deck with a really streamlined early game plan. So what to do on turns 5 and 6. Removal helps you get damage through sometimes, board wipes get such a huge value boost in Commander, and I always have some fun cards I wanted to run in the deck. Though I went Delirious one night, shaping it into its current form, fun cards like Grave Betrayal and Brain Stealer Dragon, available to view in the maybe board below the deck. All of these options turned out expensive and not proactive enough for the deck, so I just replaced them with tons and tons of card draw. Necropotence, Sign in Blood, sure, but also Starving Revenant, a card for a deck which has no way to mill itself to activate its second ability, and also Henrika Domnathi, I think I got that right, a dubious lady who draws a card and maybe kills things and maybe buffs things. Starving Revenant is actually the card that assured me that drawing cards in Commander is probably the best thing you could be doing, and I didn't know that this card existed before, and oh wow, it's really, really good, so let's pull that up and talk about it. Holy moly, this is really, really strong. I think anyway. This is a 4 mana, 4/4. When it enters the battlefield, you surveil 2. You look at the top cards of your library, top 2. You can rearrange them back on the top or mill them. Those are your choices. For each card you put back on top and don't mill, you draw a card and lose 3 life. And then whenever you draw a card, if you have 8 or more permanents in your graveyard, target opponent loses 1 and you gain 1. I think this is pretty good. It's a lot of draw for a good sized body, not super expensive. You know, draw 2 would normally be like 3 mana, maybe 2 in black, Sign in Blood. But this has a lot of upsides. You know, you can not take the damage if you want to avoid it. You can draw less cards and mill some cards. You can just mill cards. You can turn it into something that drains your opponents as you draw cards. Really good synergy with black's other card draw, which tends to do a little damage to you as you draw it. It's great, especially in a deck that has this much extra card draw. This card is a house. It's great. Super sensible choice. The point is, though, just making sure we're still lined up over here, Starving Revenant is actually the card that assures me that drawing cards in Commander is probably the best thing you could be doing. The game I said I won, it actually played no small part in. Turns out if you draw enough cards and discard down to hand size a couple times, that'll be enough permanents in graveyard to activate Starving Revenant even if you're not milling yourself. Drawing cards feels weirdly unassuming and flies under the radar quite a bit as well. Like, yes, that's why you run that draw engine, I better kill that, but there's other threats and you already drew with it, and one thing leads to another and it doesn't end up getting killed. I feel like I'm a little bit of a stickler for power levels in my playgroup, and that my other decks play on a slightly lower level than other people want to. All my other decks feel like they lag behind. Every game felt like the person who stuck down a draw engine first or cheated on mana first got such an insurmountable card quality difference to me that the best I could do was just give up on winning myself and make the number 2 favorite the winner. Thoughts? Cheers. Yes, I do have some thoughts. I think that this part, you really helped me to try to diagnose maybe what's going on and at least give you some perspective from me or options if you wanted to take them. But as I said before, it's highly subjective whether what I'll recommend will really make anything better. And also, I mean, it could just be if it doesn't work, then it's just a bunch of grumbling and trying to get people to do things in a way that they don't want to do, maybe. That's okay. It's not wrong to not do it this way. But I do have a lot of thoughts about Commander as a format, and I will give them to you now to do with what you will. It's what you said about drawing cards feeling unassuming and flying under the radar a little bit as well. I'm sure that you, having written this parlay, probably have some responses to that comment yourself, like, well, it shouldn't though, because if this has been happening at the table, I mean, people should know that you're gonna win if your card draw engine goes unanswered. And that is when I thought a little bit back to the removal thing that I discussed earlier. So previously, I had been talking about how the removal in this strategy that you've put together, well, it's higher costed. You know, it's not a lot of like 1 or 2 mana, get that thing out of the way right now. But I think that those cards would be very good in this deck in particular and are pretty good in general. And when people see, oh, but it might only kill small stuff. Yeah, but like you benefit from killing the small stuff very highly. It's good for it to kill like just the small stuff. There's a lot of removal in here. There's a good amount of board wipes in here. There's a lot of card draw in here, so you'll probably get the removal and board wipes. So it would absolutely add a lot to the deck. If there were like 5-ish cards that were, off the top of my head, Tragic Slip, Fatal Push, Dismember would be good. I feel like this isn't the right deck for those black spells that are like 1 mana, sacrifice a creature, destroy a creature. But there is one that's, I think, is like 1 mana, sacrifice a creature or artifact, destroy a creature. That might be worth playing. I think there will be situations where blowing up a mana rock later in the game to 1 mana kill a creature is good in this deck. So that could be worth considering. I don't remember what that's called. You get the idea. 5, I don't know how many of those, does mean you can just kind of snap eliminate, that first person who got a draw engine down on turn 2 somehow. I don't know, they're playing a green-blue ramp deck. You know those you know what I'm talking about, those green-blue value piles. They play a mana dork on turn 1, and they play some 3-mana draw engine on turn 2. The blue and green has like 50 of these. And then you just kill it and move on with the game. Now, 5 or so, I said. But that doesn't seem like enough, because I think that when you look at the game theory situation, well, everybody would benefit from running them, but they might not. This is where I need to do some guesstimating. The most common problem in Commander play groups is that people don't run enough removal. Don't at me. That's the most common problem. Fight me, change my mind. I love having my mind changed. As far as I can see, that is the most common problem. Second most common is not running enough land. And that means that if you run a lot of removal, but your opponents don't, there's this weird situation where when you kill the value thing, you've killed it for them. And then maybe they do their thing, but nobody else has removal, and then they win. It will become the case that the second person to drop a value engine will win, because only you'll be killing them really early, and you can see the problem. Now, another player looking at that situation might understandably go, well, I would like to interact with those too. I don't just want to die when I'm not the second person to drop a value engine, so I too will run the removal. And you can see how the meta might go in a way where everybody will run these cards and the game is interactive and fun, in my opinion. Essentially, there will be a round robin of eliminating value engines on top of the doing your own game plan thing, and this is called playing Magic the Gathering, in my opinion. However, you could also look at it as, well, if nobody will, what some people call eating their vegetables, but it's really fun when they're tasty anyway, then only you will run the little removal pieces, and it will remain a disadvantage in this specific context for you. You see what I mean? Just like how running a bunch of specific narrow counterspells, if nobody is doing anything that flashy, is surprisingly bad, even though those cards are very powerful if people make the strongest strategies they can. It's funny how decks that are very, very powerful can be shockingly weak if they're just not playing against decks that are like trying to do something really strong. Or another example would be chess tactics. If you play as if you're playing against a very strong player, but you're playing against a very weak player, a lot of the moves that would have been really strong will be unnecessarily roundabout solutions to a not very complex threat from your opponent. Something like that. And this can definitely happen in a pot of commander players. So there are a few responses to this. You could look at the situation and say, well, I'm going to endeavor to convince my play group that the game would be more fun if we all ran more cheaper removal, like more spot removal, less go big removal. And the good news is that basically every color has this. They're all really, really strong, and they're good in basically every deck. It's quite hard to imagine. I can only think of a few very weird strategies where it's bad to run Lightning Bolt. It's bad to run, Swords to Plowshares, right? Is it white? That's like one of the most egregious ones. I just see basically zero reason to not put that in most white decks. Moving on to part 2, that's actually exactly the problem, isn't it? A lot of players don't want to put in the cards that are in just every deck, and I think this is perfectly fine. Not wanting to play a deck that is just like the more common thing, that's okay. Maybe you've just seen a lot of that type of deck, or you want to go on a bit of an adventure with no kind of rubric to check. How are people building Even Death Draco Lich? I don't know. But I do know how people are building Skittles, Skitharix the Blight Dragon. Let's see if I can spell that. Nope. Skith. There we go. If you're not familiar, let's look at this card. I think, in many ways, this is a stronger commander for the deck that you've built. This is 5 mana for a 4/4 flying. It has Infect, so it will kill people in 10 damage because they get them as poison counters. And everybody dies in 10 poison counters. You could pay 1 black to give it haste, and you could pay 2 black to regen it. This is not flash. It's got a bigger butt. It's tankier. It doesn't die to Lightning Bolt that I just encouraged your entire play group to play. It regenerates itself, though 2 mana is not the cheapest thing in the world, but it regenerates itself. It's got that haste, so while it would be 6 total mana to drop this and have it attack right away, that's not so bad when you have a lot of rocks. And it will do way more damage in each of those hits. Likewise, because it has a way to protect itself and can be dropped in later right away if it's killed. They kill it when you're about to attack with it. You can just play it again right away, and you've got it to block or whatever. And you could give it haste if they kill it, with a sorcery speed board wipe and just attack with it. It will be largely the same as having flash on Even Death while being harder to kill. And so after the first time Even Death dies, unless you replay them with their ability, which is hard to use in your deck because there's not that many creatures that will have died. Let's read that ability again. You can play Even Death from your graveyard if a creature not named Even Death died this turn. Oh, it can be anyone's. Okay. So it's more expensive, but you get the point. It's very lethal in a way that Even Death isn't. And I'm not saying that means it's better to play this. It's not better in every way either, right? Like being able to keep up mana for removal. And then if they don't play something you want to kill, you can flash back in your dragon and start beating, is good. And that's just fun too. Like, I like that style of play. Draw go, where you play a ton of stuff at instant speed and you basically just do nothing on your turn. You just draw and go and spend all your mana on your opponent's turns. I love that as a play style in non-blue. In blue, it can be a little boring because you just counter everything. It's fine a few times, but in other colors where it's not that you just negate everything happening, it can be a really interesting way to play it. Like, I think it's cool that you're playing Even Death. I don't think it's bad that you're not playing this. It's not better in every way, and playing something that is stronger in some ways is not better. The goal is to have fun. Finding this sort of target with your playgroup's power level is awesome. That's great. I guess the problem, though, is figuring out what kind of game the other decks are trying to play. Because the other thing that I was saying earlier about this deck is that it doesn't really have like it doesn't create a more powerful mechanism to brawl against larger strategies. If your play group is inching toward like CEDH, people die on turn 3 to infinite combos, which it doesn't look like you are based on this deck list, if this has been doing fairly well, then yeah, I mean, you could push in that direction. But then again, you said, oh, the first person that gets fast mana tends to take over the game. Well, there is Soul Ring in here. Yes, there is. And so maybe it's like that. But I mean, if people are playing, you know, Ancient Tomb, I mean, there's just not that much you can do. I mean, certainly not on any reasonable, normal human budget. This deck in total is says the estimated cost is 172, which for a commander deck is not very expensive. You know, this is quite budget in the grand scheme of things. About the budget my decks often have, a little bit lower usually, but this is totally acceptable for the budget that my decks are often targeting. I have a lot of the cards already, you know. So if the other players in your playgroup are playing stuff that is that much faster mana, I don't know, like I get worried by the fact that you said that. So that's another thing. But we could just go around in circles all day, and that might not necessarily help. I think the first thing I would do with this deck is add the quicker, smaller scale removal in black, which fortunately there's a lot that's really good. And that will get the deck somewhere pretty quickly, all on its own. I'll give you a few other recommendations for like weird little cards that might help the situation as well. One kind of weird example of a card that could solve a problem for the deck is Night Clubber. Let's bring it slightly down. It's a 3 mana 2/2. When it enters, creatures your opponents control get -1/-1. It's like a token board wipe. Really, really cheap. And the best part is you can play Blitz pretty much all the time. Cast it for its Blitz cost, which is still just 3, and it's even less black mana, which matters because you have a lot of artifact mana generation. It gets haste, and when it dies, you draw a card, but it dies in your next end step. For 3 mana, you kill everybody's 1/1s, utility creatures, mana dorks, tokens, all dead. You get a 2/2 that swings in with haste, and it replaces itself. You draw a card. A 3 mana spell, which gives everything -1/-1 and draws you a card, would be really good. And this basically is that. I think this card is really strong in the right deck where you care about removing that kind of stuff. And it replaces itself. You know, it's very lean. It doesn't take up much space in the deck's design. So a card like this might help a lot. And again, I'm imagining more of the, you know, Tragic Slit, Fatal Push, the 1 mana black spot removal kind of stuff. I think that would benefit this deck a lot. I would maybe remove a little bit of the like greedier, very expensive removal that I'm not entirely convinced goes enough places. I really like the removal on bodies in this deck though. I don't think I would remove those. They're expensive, but this deck doesn't have very many creatures. I mean, it really doesn't have very many creatures. So I like Massacre Girl. I think Necron Deathmark makes sense. I like that it has Flash. That is also a nice pair with this deck. The removal that doesn't destroy just creatures is important because you're playing mono black. I'd probably go a little further. You know, I feel like this doesn't totally solve the problem of a player playing a lot of enchantments. It just destroys 1 value enchantment if they have it. Like if they play a Necropotence, then you're happy you have that. But if it's like an enchantment player and you need to destroy their key enchantment piece, maybe this doesn't do much. And it's 3 mana. I mean, that's expensive for just removing 1 thing from 1 player. And they get to pick what is removed. I don't know. There are also some where I feel like this deck has enough graveyard hosing that this is a little too weak, especially when the 1 mana could have been like you destroy a critical blocker. If this could be Tragic Slip instead, for example. But a lot of them, I see what you're doing. I think it makes sense to some extent. I'm a little bit worried about, yeah, the number of like opponent sacrifices a thing. These can be good, but just because the deck it has so little ways to deal with a non-creature permanent that is a problem. I guess it's good with Planeswalkers. I'm a little bit worried about the inclusion of these. I almost want to go hard for something that will destroy like a permanent instead. Another thing you could consider doing would be to run the artifact board wipes that are like destroy each non-land permanent with cost blank or less, or cost blank. Something like Ratchet Bomb or Blasting Zone is the land maybe, but more like Ratchet Bomb probably. The ones that are more surgical destroy everything that's 3 mana, something like that. It's a little dangerous in the deck right now because you have a lot of 2 mana artifacts. If you were to hit 2 or 4, or do one that does this cost or less, and it were to pass over converted mana cost 2, that would be disastrous for this deck currently. Like really, really, really bad. You would lose the game. So that, I mean, but even that is kind of a concern, right? I kind of want to diversify this removal more as well. I like what you did here to some extent. You've played a huge number of the 2 mana rocks, and so of course, some of them are the ones that give you some other utility. Like Mind Stone is a great fit for this deck. I'm not saying that's bad. But some of them that don't do anything fancy, like they don't have any bells or whistles, I feel like you might be able to find something that doesn't exactly improve how often you get to do like the 2 mana ramp 3 mana even death thing, but would still be so much more powerful in the deck as a whole that it's maybe worth it. Like I like that you included Dark Ritual in this same category. I feel like this is a smart card to include. It's a lot better if you're set up and you draw it, and it's almost as good if you want to do the even death on curve thing. Overall, like it's weird. The 2 mana artifacts that come in untapped and tap for mana right away are very good in general. But in this deck, they're surprisingly mediocre, in my opinion, because they don't make colored mana a lot of the time. Or the ones that do come into play, I thought I saw Charcoal Diamond, but I didn't, because it comes in tapped. Maybe you just omitted it. That was smart. But anyway, a lot of the ones that that come in untapped make colorless mana. This deck has a lot of black mana symbols, like a lot. It has a lot of artifacts too, but, they do build you up for mana very efficiently. You only lose 1 mana that turn, and then you have an additional mana going forward. They're very strong. I'm not saying these are not great cards, but I feel like in this specific deck, they're surprisingly mediocre because you actually really only need the mana for that one kind of mid-game stretch, and then later in the game, it would be really good if you could go bigger. And earlier in the game, something that like gives you mana one time is almost as good in a lot of situations. So I don't know. I mean, a lot of these I like. I feel like you did good work figuring out, what are the ones that have some additional utility. I like, there's some weird choices in here that I think are smart, like Ornithopter of Paradise. Great idea. It taps for black. It comes in untapped, even though you can't tap it right away, but it's a 0/2 flyer and you've got equipment. Like this can do some serious work. You could kill someone with this thing in this deck. I think this is a great place for that card. Even just a normal Ornithopter might not be bad. Which brings me to how I would add bigger mana to the deck. I think that this deck has a lot of artifacts that you could lean into. I think something like Unwinding Clock, where you untap every artifact on each opponent's untap step, go even harder for instant speed interaction, and then you just have a clockwork machine of mana giving you tons of instant speed interaction while Even Death is just sitting there, and if it dies, it's got flash and you can play it from your graveyard, just flash it back in on someone else's, turn or whatever. Making an artifact mana engine where you can repeatedly recur Even Death over and over again without the commander tax being an issue. You maybe even go so far as to remove some of the protection because it just becomes so easy to replay Even Death over and over again. And then eventually, once you've machine gunned everything to death and Even Death has been played for the 15th time for still only 4 mana, you suit it up with like a Lash Writhe or whatever and kill someone. That sounds great. I would be more interested in removing a little bit of protection, planning to replay Even Death way more times, a little bit of cheaper removal, and then big mana stuff like artifact mana acceleration like Unwinding Clock, or there's a lot of others. You'll have to look into that, but you'll find stuff. Unwinding Clock is a good place to start. And then like Nirkana Revenant, the things that double swamp mana generation. You don't need an insane amount of mana, but those will really kick the deck's mana generation into overdrive. You'll end up getting 3 or 4 more mana per cycle just from playing one of those cards. I think it will end up making a huge difference. And I would also very heavily bias toward instant speed interaction. I didn't do this that much here, but if you looked for black and artifact ways to actually make Even Death stronger at instant speed, I think that would add up. Having it be that you don't need to spend the mana on your turn does help a little bit. I think a concern with this deck is once people play the amount of mana that would be effective against this deck, the amount of removal, excuse me, that would be effective against this deck, they're going to know you're going to go to equip Even Death. And what's going to happen, in my mind, is you've played your Even Death, you keep mana open to do instant speed interaction, you kill something, the deck is doing pretty well, your turn comes around, you go, pay 5 mana to equip Batterskull to Even Death, and ideally, your opponent would go, I Lightning Bolt your Even Death. And if it's got protection, fine. If it doesn't, oh no. And because that will happen so predictably, so regularly, I have a feeling the deck is going to be put out a lot of mana. So I'm not saying no protection is good, but more of an attrition-like strategy where you really only go to do that when you've had a long slugfest of eliminating your opponent's value engines and commanders and stuff could be very effective. You could save a lot of that mana. You could go more for smaller equipments that give you a lot of damage rather than the more vigilance-focused direction I had in mind before. So I don't know, those are just a bunch of thoughts on what way to take the deck in. I just feel like this deck is paying a lot of space for not actually setting that much up. Again, the last thing I want to talk about is draw. I feel like this is a huge amount of draw. It's really great that you have a lot. I think a lot of decks, the problem is they really don't have a lot. Again, they don't what is often referred to as eating your vegetables. But again, like, it's fun to do game actions in Magic. It's not eating your vegetables. Players just haven't experienced how fulfilling it is to have a deck where you draw friggin' cards. But it sounds like your play group has. I feel like this is maybe too many by a little bit. There are some of them where I feel like I like the idea, but because they don't do anything else the deck wants to do, I'm a little bit concerned that they're not worth it. For example, there are some, like, 2 mana you draw 2 cards, but it's sorcery speed and there's no other upside. I feel like you might be able to find better stuff. I mean, I don't know. Sign in Blood is really strong, but if it could be something at instant speed, I don't know. Yeah, it's hard. Those are still pretty good. You probably don't want to cut those. But like, I like this. I'm covering it up a little bit. Succumb to Temptation is 3 mana. You draw 2 cards and lose 2 life, but it's instant speed, which I think this deck really, really wants. That idea is good. I think that was a smart inclusion. Underworld Connections, fine, maybe. You get the more steady card draw. It's a powerful draw engine. I really like the idea of Transmogren's Crown and especially Strength Testing Hammer. Mask of Memory makes total sense to me. I think that's smart. But again, a lot of them, I feel like it's just not quite efficient enough. Is it enough to, it's 5 mana and you get a beater and you give people goats. I love this card. But in terms of card draw, I feel like this is just a really good card in Commander, and it's not actually that amazing in this strategy. I don't know. Or things like Blood Tracker comes to mind. Like this, I almost want to say this is a touch slow, or if they spot removal it immediately, you can try to activate it in response, but depending on how much mana you have, and it's a lot of mana, I don't love this. That's just me. It's not terrible. It's a creature, which is kind of nice. I like Custody Lich. I like that this is removal and you put the Monarch mechanic in play at the same time, that roll compression. So I don't know. If you can cut a little bit from some of those categories, just the worst of them, or the ones that aren't doing double duty elsewhere, without cutting like Night's Whisper and Sign in Blood, I guess you shouldn't cut those. But finding, what you can remove without losing too much and keep the roll compression, anyone that, kills stuff or is a creature, I feel like I would keep those. Try to add more instant speed stuff and just add mana engines. That might be enough for this deck to kick it into high gear a little. Just as a quick final aside, I feel like especially in monocolor decks, it's really valuable to pursue the cards that do a thing that is kind of unique in that color, that's kind of uncommon to be able to do in that color. The card that comes to mind in this case is Imp's Mischief. This is a 2-minute instant. You change the target of target spell with a single target, usually a red effect or sometimes blue. You lose life equal to its mana value, basically irrelevant, doesn't matter. You can redirect a spell for 2 mana. I think this is unbelievably strong in Commander. These kinds of effects are extremely powerful in Commander. They scale very well into multiplayer games because you can redirect an opponent's spell at you, at someone else, or at their thing. That's normally good. But there are so many spells going off. The concern with these cards in a one-on-one Magic game is that they might be a bit narrow. Nobody will cast something you want to redirect. But in Commander, when you know for sure basically everybody has a creature or a planeswalker in play anyway, and there are 4 people casting spells, there are so many ways you can get value out of this. Also, just as an aside, it says target spell. It doesn't even have to be removal. People often think, oh, you redirect removal, and that's very good. I think that's often the good thing to do, but they enchant their creature for value. Change the target to your creature instead, stuff like that. They enchant their land to ramp it, that kind of like enchantment-based ramp. You enchant yours instead. You get the mana right back, and they lose their ramp. It can be very, very strong. I think this effect is very good in Commander generally. It's also fun, in my opinion. A really good way to get your theft fix on, in my opinion, while being just cool. Just scales very well. Just as one final aside, I wanted to say that I feel your pain with the cards that you added for what you considered to be fun, but they just didn't fit the deck that well. And I wanted to talk about them a little bit. So you mentioned trying to add Brainstealer Dragon and Grave Betrayal. They're just terrible fits for this deck, but I understand why you want to play those cards. And I think it does beg the question, what does this deck want at its top end? Like, what do you want to do at turns 5 and 6? And I suggested a few things, like just kicking into higher gear with bigger mana generation, so you can be playing multiple removal spells, multiple draw spells, and really take advantage of having a lot of draw and having a very compact game plan. You really need to find those few equipments, and you've got your commander to beat people up in the command zone. So go into high gear with the draw, go bigger. Think of it as multipliers. If you've already got a lot of draw spells, and you're playing a lot of little 1-mana rocks, finding a card that, rather than just drawing you even more cards, increases the amount of mana you have to spend, on drawing cards, would really amplify the deck's output. Finding the thing that would amplify the deck's output the most is, I think, the trick. Are you ending games with 6 or 7 cards in your hand? More mana generation. Do you have more mana than you have cards to cast? More card draw. And then eventually those equilibriate and you get a deck that has maximum output. And then, fill the rest of the space with removal and, call it a day if you have a compact game plan like this. I was just going to say that my own experience of wanting to play Brainstealer Dragon and Grave Betrayal, 2 cards I also really like, was usually brought out by, once you've made a deck this way and you've gotten it to work well, if you have multiple decks in mind, you'll find a place for those cards. There will be a deck that kind of wants to go big like that. I think the reason they're not that great in here is just because they don't do anything related to this deck's agenda. Like, a lot of the things that you have that power up your creatures are equipment that only powers up one creature, so you don't particularly benefit from having other bodies. It doesn't like mill opponents in particular, and you have a good amount of graveyard hate, so they might not even have that much stuff to steal. This deck is quite focused on its own thing. I think Voltron decks in general tend to be a little bit less... it benefits them less if they steal stuff from opponents, because they have a very narrow game plan. Only a narrow slice of effects actually benefit them, though things that are good in Magic in general, like removal and card draw, are kind of good everywhere, of course. So I get that. There are definitely places where those cards are good, though. I just wanted to encourage you that you'll be able to make other decks that are, as good as this or better with your playgroup's idea of fun. Again, I hope I was able to give advice without stepping on too many toes in this situation. It's not bad to want to do things differently, or just your answer to why not play this is, I just don't want to play the mana doublers or whatever. That's perfectly fine. I do think it is useful to make sure you have an eye on your playgroup, though. If they do want to play those things and you don't, it is going to be hard to play the same game that they are, like, without it leaving you behind, basically. You will have to bend over quite backwards to find, like, the powerful strategies. I was going to talk a lot about that with my own experience in this parlay, but I felt like that was enough to say that it didn't make sense to do, so I chose not to. But if you would like to hear more of that, it's something we could talk about sometime. Maybe a story for another time. Just ways of thinking about the playgroup shaping itself up. Overall, I'll say what I almost always say when we talk about Magic on the stream or in Parley or whatever. which is that Commander has this problem where it's not really a complete format. In Standard and Modern, the people making the game have deliberately done work to make it so the format has a kind of structure or cadence. Things that do this thing faster than this are kind of above the speed limit. And by keeping the format coherent that way overall, mostly, banning stuff, printing cards appropriately for those formats, they don't do that great of a job in 2024, but I mean, generally, this is something these formats have. In Modern or Legacy, you could say, well, people can combo kill on turn X very specifically, right? Whereas in Commander, the format is so big, I mean, if you use everything that the format gives you access to, you can be killing people that quickly. But it's so much more broad. It's so much less specific. There are not bans that are the same kind of banned cards as for other formats. It's not bans to structure the format in a certain way. Commander is not a complete format. You cannot just play Commander. That doesn't exist. I know vampbug kind of knows this, and that's why I left it till the end. But just as a reminder that there is no, standard Commander that we all play. If you're gonna have to design one anyway, CEDH or My Weird, we don't shuffle, and you have a ton of removal, but it's a little bit expensive sometimes, and everybody has lots of interaction, battle cruiser thing that my group is doing, or whatever your group is doing. I would just encourage you to keep in mind that contrivances, deciding on some further rules that are how your group plays, are required for the format to be good interactive Magic. You cannot have it be as anywhere near as fun as it could be anyway, without those things. So it's not weird, or I'm basically just trying to give you, because I know vampbug kind of knows this, I'm just trying to give people an argument if they talk about this with their folks. Sometimes I would imagine people saying, oh, I think it'd be fun if we played like this. But then the point where I see a lot of people in my personal life, or some of you have told me this, where I see it fall apart is that you don't have an argument necessarily ready for why that would be. I feel like vampbug maybe does, actually. But some people, I don't know who you is here, but I would have appreciated this in my own personal life when I was first playing Commander with people, and I know I see this in lots of other people as well. It might be useful to have, but why would we, deliberately add a ton more removal? Because it will make the game interactive and fun. Who wins will come down to a battle of wits rather than who slams a draw engine first that none of us played removal that's cheap enough for. This is not a criticism, vampbug. I'm just giving you an example. I hope I did an okay job. This was a daunting parlay, but I thought it was really fun. I had a lot to say, as you can probably tell. So thank you very much for requesting it. Folks, if you'd like to get your own parlay like this one, you can do that using a link in the description. Love to have you. For now, I'll say looking forward to the next one.